And yes, good day, everyone. Thanks very much for coming to join us for this session. I've managed to participate in a few of the last ones, maybe 3 or 4, and it's been amazing. I think it's an excellent opportunity to meet with you all, and congratulations to Iasa for hosting this. My topic is around the use of architecture as an enabler for business model innovation. This is a topic that's very near and dear to our hearts. Before I get into that, I'll just a couple of words about myself and Capsify, who we are. Capsify is a Sydney-based software company. We call ourselves a knowledge engineering company. We're particularly interested in capturing and consolidating knowledge about a business operating model. And our whole vision is to create what we call the connected enterprise, where knowledge is consolidated, aligned, and made traceable so that you're able to get some extraordinary insights from bringing together disparate, fragmented content. We do that through our platform called Jalapeno. We call it a knowledge workbench. And what you get, I guess, at the end of it, and why would you go about doing all this and investing in it, is particularly for this topic I'm going to try and talk more about today, of business model innovation, and the idea that that actually is a continuous practice that you'd be involved in. So in defending that thesis, as it were, these are the 3 topics I'm going to try to talk about. The obligatory transformation bullet point. What would an enterprise architecture presentation be without talking about transformation? My goal is not to try and explain what it is, perhaps even opposite, but mostly try to talk about what is actually driving all of this talk about transformation. And as I unpack that, get into the topic of resilience. And I know that in the last couple of months, obviously, the COVID crisis has particularly brought this topic to a head. Resilience in this case, though, is not so much necessarily only about crisis management, but really about the ongoing ability to deal with change. And change is really the key topic that's going to be tying these bullet points together. So finally, coming down is the topic of then business model innovation, and how can you prepare your business, and how can architects get involved in contributing to this significant need. Okay, so transformation. I'm going to begin with, always good to start with, the contentious proposition, which I don't know if this is really that contentious. Pretty much everybody that I've been hearing today is saying something similar. But the real point being here that digital transformation is not really about us buying some technologies to digitize our business. In fact, if that was the case, you'd probably all be going, well, we've been doing this for 20, 30 years. We've been digitizing our business. Why is it that suddenly these 2 words, digital transformation, have become so top of mind and penetrating the conversation of everybody involved in any kind of change initiative? In my view, so it's not really about the enabling technologies as much as the digital value propositions. And in fact, digital transformation to me is much more about dealing with the exponential pace of technology innovation in general, and the effect that that's having on the environment in which we operate. It's much more about the technologies that our customers, our suppliers, and our communities are adopting, rather than the technology that we're going to put in to automate some part of our business. So yes, things like AI and RPA and all these other things are digital technologies, but I don't believe that they are the fundamental things about why we need to focus on digital transformation. Those are just natural evolutions in technology that enterprise adopts. When we talk about digital transformation of our businesses, this is far more profound. It's really something that touches every single part of the business, and not just the IT organization. Because what we're really talking about here is changing our value propositions, understanding new ways of interacting with organizations. And the whole reason for doing this is because those technologies are enabling competition shifting and creating brand new business models that are attacking many of the incumbent leaders in their spaces and forcing them to rethink what their business is about. So really, digital transformation is about business model innovation at the end of it. And so this exponential pace of technology innovation, let's have a look at that a little bit deeper. And why? Well, there's no doubt that this is actually one of the top challenges facing major global organizations and CEOs. Well, how do we know that? Well, the survey says, Fortune magazine, a recent survey that they did of their 500 CEOs, 72% put the rapid pace of technology innovation as their most significant challenge that they face. And of course, it's not the technology, but it's the impact that that technology is having on their business. Many of you would know Jeannie Ross and her amazing book that has been very inspirational to me in the mid 2000s. Prior to this one, which was with Peter Wheel, Enterprise Architecture Strategy, and probably a book that really shaped a lot of my own thinking on the topic of enterprise architecture as a business, as an enabler of business decisions. And just most recently, you may be aware, Jeannie's pushed out this new book, Design for Digital. She was out in Australia actually just last year promoting it. One of the key things that she talks about, exactly what I just mentioned, the difference between digitizing your business and the digital value proposition. But the other thing that she talks about is this concept of the pace of change and what it is that's underpinning this pace of change. And the three transformative forces she describes are unlimited connectivity, the ability of our customers and our ecosystems to be plugged in, massive processing power that we all have access to, which allows us options in the way in which we interact with one another and with our customers and our providers. And then thirdly, the incredible amount of data that's out there that helps inform decision making, but and perhaps even inhibit decision making. So let's just have a quick look at each of those three, and just as in providing some sort of context of what the exponential pace is like in each of those. So I'm sure you've seen many of these exponential curves. Just a few here that I found particularly interesting. This one in particular, showing us where we're going with connectivity. I mean, we're not even interested anymore in talking about how people are connected. We know everybody on the planet just about has a phone and is connected. But the Internet of Things, where devices are becoming connected, is just quite astounding to look at these numbers of 50 billion connected devices this year. Everything that you can possibly imagine. In my bedroom, unfortunately, I have a ceiling fan, and the first thing it did when we turned it on for the first time said, "Oh, you're connected to the internet for some reason." And I don't have any idea what's transmitting out there. But that's the type of thing we're all living with right now, where there isn't a device that you buy. I think my red mate is probably also connected somehow. So what this is causing is just not just the fact that all of these things have now got potential to communicate and to provide information back and forth, but the data that they are actually producing is obviously having a huge impact on some of these other topics, and having to then sift through and understand what that data means. So dealing with this type of explosion, if you're in the business where devices are in any kind of have any kind of thing to play, you can imagine what that impact is. This chart is actually a fairly old one, but I just love it because it is such a great explanation of the exponential change that we're seeing in processing power. When it goes back to, it's just about a century now, I think, since the first calculating machines came about. And of course, we're all familiar with the whole history of computing. The interesting thing to me has been how we're just about, in this last decade, we've been approaching the case where the average computer surpasses the brain power of a mouse, 2015. 8 years later, it surpassed the brain power of a human being. The average computer has more computing power, processing power, than the brain power of a human being. Just 8 years later, it's either going extremely fast or there's really not much difference there. But I think it's certainly going, and it's not really far from there when 2045, I think this is the singularity really, when the average computer, not all of them, one average computer you go out and buy on your desktop, surpasses the brain power equivalent to all of human brains combined. Right? So this is the type of computing power that we are all having access to, that we carry around actually on our phones, for example. So quite extraordinary what we have at our disposal and what that obviously means for what we can do as human beings. Finally, ubiquitous data, and you've probably seen a lot of these quotes in the past, or about 90% of the world's data created in the past 3 years. Just astounding to think of what that actually means and where it's all coming from, mostly from those fans and bread makers that we talked about earlier. But if you look at, yes?
Terry, sorry, can I just quickly jump in? I've just noticed that we're getting both the presentation and the presenter view being shared. So it seems like you're sharing the entire desk. So I'm not sure if there's any sense there, just it's making the slides quite small.
I get it. Let me try just that one. How's that?
That is the left-hand side. Oh, there it goes. That's much better. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that before I got too far. Okay. You're actually getting a sneak peek at what's coming next, I guess. So ubiquitous data. So 90% of the world's data created in the past 3 years. And on this side here, just how's that all come about? Well, this is a fantastic graph here that starts off with predictions by Buckminster Fuller around knowledge at the beginning of the century, beginning of the 1900s. It was doubling every century. Around the middle of that century, it was doubling every 25 years. In the 80s, it was down to doubling every year. And IBM is now predicting that this year, the world's knowledge is doubling every 12 hours. In other words, twice a day, doubling. Gosh, I mean, so you can just imagine the effect then of all of this is having on businesses. And the effect is clearly seen in, for example, this, that, and you've probably seen these sort of stats before, that in the past 15 years, over half of the S&P 500 companies have actually disappeared off of the index. They no longer exist, or they've been acquired, or something's happened to them. And since that index was created, 60 odd years ago, the average lifespan of a company on the index was about 61 years. Now, companies don't stay on that index for any longer than about 17 years. In other words, we're just turning over businesses at such a pace, and what's causing that, obviously, is the change that they're having to deal with. Okay, so hopefully that pace of change, you can imagine the impact, you can imagine what this is causing for executives to have to deal with that. So in fact, if we then come back to it, the ultimate truth, the digital transformation, what it's really about is building the capacity to deal with this continuum and to ourselves continuously transform. So it's not about transformation, but it's about continuously transforming. And we can think about that as being really developing enterprise resilience. That's my little introduction then to what's the cause of transformation. So let's talk about resilience. We've been putting together as a business a lot of thinking about what do we mean by resilience, and how do you create an enterprise that is resilient to change. And then of course along came the ultimate change that we could have expected in our lifetime, and in a fashion that none of us could have ever imagined, at a pace that none of us could have imagined. And it just shows you what remarkable times we're living in. So how do you actually then prepare your organization to deal with this type of both ongoing, continuous change and sudden dramatic change like we've just been experiencing. We believe that this little framework is a very good way of thinking about it, and there are so many competing pieces to this puzzle that actually, if you look at it, they're all totally reliant on one another and interlinked. So the starting point are what we call these foundational building blocks down the bottom, right? And it's really about getting a very good handle on what are we trying to achieve and how are we actually managing to do that. And I'll talk mostly about this in a little while, and it's mostly about the knowledge that we have and we generate, describing what we're trying to achieve, and then describing how our business operates. It's actually quite startling when we stop and we think about how inaccessible a lot of this information is to the people that need to make decisions to make our business innovate. And so getting all of that together, which is exactly the challenge that we as a business try to address, is fundamental to be able to build anything on and go anywhere further. Having that in place, though, is just the starting point. And so what can you do with that? And really what we have to do as organizations is build this transformation muscle to allow us to continuously innovate our business models. And the three components of that are things that you're probably very familiar with and aware. The idea of continuous delivery. We have been getting pretty good at that over the past couple of decades with agile methods and this idea of ongoing iterative change, shifting away from discrete project thinking towards this idea of an ongoing agile releases and a machinery of change that we build into our organization. So much so that people are talking about, that the agile ways of thinking are moving out of just technology projects and into the way that we organize and structure our businesses. So the great thing about that is that it's effective and it does things in an ongoing basis. Its Achilles heel is that it all is based on the presumption of this mythical thing called the backlog of change. In other words, somebody is feeding stuff into a backlog and saying, change this. And that's really the presumption that's being done correctly is often a big presumption. How do we actually know that we're getting the right stuff done? And that's where this idea of innovation comes in. People are getting better and better at thinking about design, about these practices of innovative thinking. Unfortunately, a lot of this, though, is still in that sort of innovation garage type of place. The people with the coloured socks and the young, innovative young people with creative minds who we put into a workshop, pass on some incredible thinking to us as an organization, and then go out the door and leave us to try and figure out how to move it on from there. So industrializing those garages or those workshops, turning those into an innovation factory, democratizing the concept of ideas and getting those ideas captured at the coalface of the customer interactions, so that we're actually being able to really feed and manage those ideas through a life cycle of stages where we can elaborate them, test them, prioritize them, map them into our value, and determine where they should go. And that brings me to the next thing, which is, yes, so we can learn about how to do that better. We can feed our backlog better, but all of this could be completely off track if we just don't have a very sharp, clear idea of what represents value to the business. And so this idea of value mapping and understanding, unpacking the anatomy of value. How do you describe value? What are the various components of the value and the dimensions of value? Both, you can just think of a few being things like shareholder value might be completely different than competing actually with perhaps customer value, and both of those might have nothing to do with, say, some of your sort of environmental concerns about value and many other things So understanding all of these various map value dimensions, but then being able to not only know what represents value to you, but have those value artifacts described in such a way that they're accessible to the people and who are trying to come up with change and who are trying to manage change, and so that they can understand, and all of these change ideas can be prioritized against what you think is value. Okay, so inside of each of these things, you can imagine there's a whole lot more to talk about, and certainly there is. And inside of our product, if you ever get a chance to look at it, we've actually started to build out all of those pieces. So I'm going to quickly just show you a couple of those ideas, and then talk about the challenge you then have in bringing this all together so that there's connectedness and alignment between everything. So in each of those layers of that framework, as I mentioned, as you can imagine, another layer down, more detail. On the strategic purpose layer, we very guided by the business motivation model. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. The idea that we have something that we're trying to achieve, desired results. We have some ideas of how we're going to achieve those through courses of action. We understand the importance of being able to then govern ourselves through our policy frameworks and so on. And so being able to then elaborate and decompose, create your goals and objectives, align them to your strategies and tactics, and manage those against the posts. So we've been doing this for a while, and it's a very nice meta model, I guess, of a strategic plan to break things down into these parts. Where we think that there's a great opportunity to extend that, obviously, is to then look at these courses of action and turn those into actual business outcomes. What are the tangible changes, therefore, that we plan to make in our business operating model, in our value propositions, and our product offerings? And so, in other words, turning these courses of action into something actually tangible and mappable into the business operation. But of course, as I just said, aligning all of these things also up into these concepts of these value drivers and value maps. So we enhance this concept of the business operating model, the business motivation model, in both of these directions. The target operating model. What does an operating model look like? You know, we talk about the operating model as an asset, and I'll get into that in a sec. Most people, if you ask them, what does an where do you keep your operating model? What does it look like? Have you got a target operating model artifact? Or a repository? Do you have somewhere where you keep this stuff in it? What do you include in it? It's actually surprisingly nefarious to the whole idea of what is an operating model. How do you describe an operating model? Well, I'm thinking of it as very much a capability-based approach. So the capability map itself creates this really nice and structured, we call it the organizing scaffold of your organization, decomposing down what you do hierarchically from some very high-level perspectives, and then unpacking those as you go. And if you can get that framework in place and do that in a collaborative way, getting the buy-in of all of your various stakeholders to that scaffold, this establishes then a common perspective that you can all share as you think about how the business functions. Now, what are capabilities for? Well, certainly much more than that. Once that scaffold is in place, you've got all kinds of really rich things that you can do. Across those capabilities, you're able to do assessments of your maturity. How well are we doing on each of these things? And those can be really quite elaborate. It could be not just general maturity, but maturity across multiple dimensions, and as is 2Ds and everything in between. Each of these capabilities is mapped down into the operating model elements, and we think of them across the 4 traditional dimensions: people, process, information, and technology. So for every capability, you have those particular business units, roles, organizational skills that you need to address those capabilities, and you're able to create those mappings and actually get down into these and figure out, well, how well are we doing on each of those skills, and what's the impact on our capabilities, and what are the competencies we need on these skills, what are the performance we have on these people against these competencies on these skills, and in this business unit, in that role, on that capability. You can see the thread evolving here, and that can help drive your thinking about uplifting the people parts of your organization as you go through change. If you're going to uplift the capability, what are the skills you need to address? And perhaps also just recutting the whole way you think about your organization and moving away from those organizational hierarchies into skills-based thinking about the types of people that you keep in your agile ways of working in loose aggregated teams. Obviously, process as well, down into your process catalogs, and a lot of people that today have been talking about where process is going with the automation of that into the RPA, down into the getting better and better at actually interacting directly with machines as from the models that we've driven on our processes. But of course, this alignment between simple thing to do gets to set up initially, but extremely valuable as you then, and we'll get into into the concept of value streams in a second, but alignment between what you're doing in your capabilities and how you're executing those in your process models. Information, another obvious one, every capability grounded in some core information object that it is managing, and then this being really the business definition of information mapped down into the technology views, and of course then technology itself. The application portfolio, its life cycle stages, where you're at, and then which are the technologies or the systems, that enable those applications, and so on. So the traditional EA space perhaps down over here, but fully integrated EA as a enabler of better business capabilities. Okay, so having all of this not only articulated and documented and described, but connected in such a way that from here you can click through and link through each of these things, and you can see the impact of something changing here on everything else. This is really something that, to me, it's quite mind-blowing that as an industry, we are still so inefficient at providing those sorts of interactive, dynamic insights to our business executives, because without those, you just really are shooting in the dark. And every single time that we want to do any kind of change, the effort that it takes to go across these things and to come up with PowerPoints, really, that's what we get, PowerPoint presentations that are meant to represent, some sort of understanding of what this operating model is about and what the impacts would be. How can you possibly do impact analysis, what scenarios, and to make decisions when we have information that is so fragmented. Okay, now then comes the delivery. I'm going to try and move things along. So delivery obviously is very much focused around change. Of course, the business perspective of change, what are the business initiatives, what are the benefits that we're looking at getting, and then moving that into the delivery side of change. Planning your portfolio and tracking and managing the portfolio. And the idea here being that that we are in this continuous loop of feeding stuff in, and that the ongoing roadmap, innovation roadmap, is just a continuous thing that just cycles on and on and on. So getting that machinery of change, and I think we talked about having we're good at the actual agile delivery part of things, getting people into a sprint, getting the Kanban board, managing tasks iteratively. What we're perhaps not that good at is the agile portfolio that we have to manage across multiple streams of work and consolidating this at scale. Yes, of course, we have these frameworks that are helping us to do that, but I think the adoption of those and the actual execution of those is still in its infancy across most organizations. So a big challenge here, but of course, it's led by the fact that we are in a little bit we're moving probably faster here than the rest of the other balls along here in being able to support what to feed that. And if we can get better at that, that's going to certainly, I think, help us with our delivery. So how do we get better? It's all about this area, this idea of industrializing innovation, moving from the garage to the factory, understanding that ideas are free, everyone can have one. When they have an idea, capture the idea, log it somewhere, allow that idea to fall randomly into some idea repository, and then being able to figure out what to do with it. Prioritizing it, obviously against the value maps talked about, but all kinds of other things We have, and then if we decide that it's got legs, we want to move it forward, being able to tie that into the design teams. Do those design teams actually have access to these ideas that people are coming up with? Do we actually communicate across these siloed parts of our organization and make sure that, or do we just sit people in a workshop room and say, come up with ideas over there, and whilst the real world is operating out at the core face over here? I don't know. Let's link all of these things together. Business case, develop the business case, and then manage it. And then if something makes it all its way through all of that, feed it into the backlog of delivery. Okay, and of course, we want to talk about prioritization. How do we prioritize? When we prioritize based on this concept of value. And the anatomy of value is actually, as we're deeply into the concept of ontology, which means going through and understanding how concepts connect and relate. So this idea of anatomy is innate to our thinking. And so the anatomy of value is a fantastically rich area that I think there's so much opportunity for us to continue exploring. But we think of value streams as one of the most fundamental organizing artifacts that you can apply to a business to break down the siloed, structured organizational way of thinking and get people aligned along the delivery of value to your customers. Because at the end of the day, that's actually the only purpose of your being. Maybe it's not customer, stakeholder, whoever it is, there's some sort of value creation that's being generated in your business, otherwise there's no purpose for existing. So identifying what those value streams are is an obvious first step, right? The first thing that we do when we come into an organization, what are your value streams? Most organizations, you probably don't have more than a dozen or so of these things. It's not rocket science. You probably call them end-to-end processes or something like that. So let's go and get those, lay them out on the table and say, what is it? What is the value that's being delivered across each of those? Who's the customer? And what's the value proposition? The value proposition is about deciding for every customer, what is the offering that we're offering them? So unpacking that value proposition, figuring out for each individual customer segment, what's the unique characteristics of the offering? That's exactly what defining the value proposition is. And that value proposition broken down and delivered through a value stream to, guess what? A customer. And the customer experiences the value stream how? As a customer journey. So we can, and with direct feedback from our customers, understand the customer, segment the customer, the personas, the experience teams are doing that, but they're doing it in a complete silo. Here they are, sorry. Yeah. So we understand there's all this work going on around figuring out who our customers are. There's all this work going around capturing the experience of those things. And what do we do with that experience information? We put it into PowerPoint deck, or at best maybe an Adobe Illustrator picture, because we're creative people in this space, and they're mostly focused on building pretty things. But those pretty things are not connected into anything tangible or structured that the architects and everybody else have done this part of the world of thinking. So they really are another information silo, rich in information that has to be fully connected, because they represent the outside-in view of value. We can't be just focused on this inside out. What's the inside out? Well, obviously the value stream is about organizing business capabilities and orchestrating them across these values. That's the connection down into the operating model, right? So the value but if we don't have this connection up here, it's only very much a one-sided view on delivery of value. This is the feedback loop we need from the customers on how that's going. So all of this absolutely essential to being able to understand what it is that we need to be changing. And when I was saying capturing ideas, where do you capture them? You capture them right here on the value stream. I have an idea on how we connect this part of the value stream. Metrics down here. Where do you log your metrics against? Across the value stream. Where do you collect the metrics from? The measures are coming from the customers or the performance of the value streams, right? So all of your ideas are around making this better. Okay, let's get into the innovation. How do you then make all of the nice little pre-pictures of that framework? How do you actually put that all together and assemble it into something that people can actually implement? We talk about this, we talked about right at the beginning, our company is a knowledge engineering company. And the key thing that we try to do is create this concept of a connected enterprise. Well, the basis of a connected enterprise is this fully integrated business operating model. Now, when you ask people today, where does your business model live today? Where do you keep your operating model? What do you do to manage the ongoing change as in your business operation from the operating model perspective? Nobody can answer that question. They look at us with a blank look on their face when we ask them, where does your business model live today? The business operating model is your most important core strategic asset. This is something that has to be enduring, dynamic, accessible, interactive, and available to business people to make business decisions. In fact, what's the reality? The reality is that we have these fragmented, out-of-date, redundant, duplicated, disconnected views of our business. Every single stakeholder has a different one. Sometimes these things have concepts in them that are represented across others, but they're not the same thing, because if I change something here about a role, it certainly doesn't mean it's changed anywhere else where we talk about a role or anything else like that. So these are all just knowledge. Every single one of these tools that generates these things is great, giving you great insights, but they're just contributing to this same issue of fragmented knowledge. And this is perhaps one of our biggest inhibitors of agile decision making. The other interesting thing about knowledge, business knowledge, is that the more you get to examine and understand it and look at what are the types of it and what is the knowledge that makes up the operating model, what you discover is that most business knowledge is actually created for transformation initiatives. Nobody gives us budget to go out and analyze the business and to build the business operating model. The only chance we have of doing that is to harvest it on the back of a project. And what actually happens in reality, though, is unfortunately that most of the knowledge that's created for an initiative is only got the lifespan of the project. We only seem to think that it's important for managing to driving the change that we're about to execute, and we lose sight of the fact that investment in that knowledge, oftentimes nearly up to half the cost of the project, becomes wasted and lost. So our whole approach is to try to address this problem by treating knowledge as an enduring, incrementally evolving asset. Only ever analyze things once, never have to go and do an as-is analysis again, by turning that into something enduring. How do we do that? Well, since we began, our company's been building up these business operating models on the basis of a concept of knowledge graph. Now, knowledge graphs are gaining popularity now, and it's fantastic. We began this back in the mid-2000s as an academic exercise. We set out with the problem to say, well, if you wanted to model a business, what would be all the things that you need to model, and how do they fit together? And that led us into the world of enterprise ontology, ontology, and then we realized that what we're trying to do is build an enterprise ontology. What are all the concepts in an enterprise? What are the common concepts across all these various knowledge areas, and how do they fit together? And that really is perhaps the fundamental intellectual property in our platform, Jalapeno platform, is this knowledge graph. The platform comes with this connected meta model. You can think of it as a fully reconciled meta model of an enterprise that's sitting there in the back end. This is a quick representation of how it all ties together. So that knowledge graph is available for us to start loading content into, or connecting out to other knowledge wherever it sits. We don't have to be the repository. We're just the web of connectedness of knowledge. So what do I mean by that? Well, maybe you would load in an application portfolio, a process catalog, a capability map, your business strategies, your project portfolio. Project portfolio, maybe the portfolio, but the projects itself, probably not. dynamic content like that would have no real, it would be pointless to be constantly trying to synchronize that. So we can just go out and play the data where it lies through APIs, any application that has a RESTful API, we can just go in, connect to that external knowledge and map it to the concepts in the repository. But the point really being is that it's the relationships between the knowledge which is important to us. Once those things are established, and it's actually quite a lot simpler than you might think. The next stage is, of course, just being able to query that. And the querying of it, actually what it means is just pulling the threads on those relationships. How do you pull the threads? Well, often it's just by being able to click through from one thing to another by way of the relationship. And so there's infinite click through. Everything that you look at in the tool is obviously connected to something else. You can never reach the end. You can always just follow the path of whatever you're trying to uncover. And how do you do that? You do that through these, the front end of this model view controller architecture, which is really just a whole bunch of visualization widgets, every hopefully improving, interactive, intuitive, aimed at business users. This is a business asset that we're creating. This is not a technology asset. It's not for the technology. Well, certainly it's definitely very useful to the technology teams, but the real value is to be able to give business owners and business executives access to the content and the knowledge and the insights that they need to be able to drive decision making. Now, just a little bit more on knowledge graphs, because I'm a huge fan of them, and I'm sure you're all hearing the word come up. It's on all the Gartner hype cycles at the moment, and the whole concept of knowledge graphs is becoming more and more common and popular. Lots of the major technology vendors are using them. In fact, Google Knowledge Graph is perhaps one of the more commonly known examples of a knowledge graph, and it's what drives the whole Google search engine, but Facebook and others as well. So what is a knowledge graph, and why does it actually, why is it of any benefit to organizing knowledge? Well, this next slide, which isn't mine, but which I wish it was, which is such a good explanation of the value of a knowledge graph. It's this concept of the knowledge continuum. It's been around for ages, so you probably have all seen some form of it or another. I'll just go over it again very quickly. So the idea here is that knowledge actually increases in value as you move up this continuum, or things move in. So it's not really knowledge, because over here, data is not really knowledge at all. Data is just facts. It's the symbols and signals that represent that something is coming at you. The best way that I can describe data in what I think is meant to mean here is the old screeching of the modems that we used to have when we connected to the internet. That there was clearly loads of data coming at you over that line and bursting into your eardrums, but you have no way of actually understanding what that is. It's like a foreign language, right? There's data coming at you, but unless you understand the structure of what that data means, you can't make any sense of it. So to interpret data, we need structure, and that's what when we have structure, we get information. These are our information models, the patterns that explain what data means, and that we can insert instances of data into these patterns, and we have the idea of concepts here and instances of data here that we can fit into these concepts. This is the world of IT that we live in all today. We have data models that explain data, and then we have code that defines the logic of how we use this data and what we should use it for. And so, in other words, code sits here. The code really is actually just about logic, but and that can be to a very large degree supplanted by the idea of context. Because if we understand not just the patterns, but how all these patterns are connected into some greater knowledge meaning, right? In other words, what the relationships are between these patterns and what the meaning of these relationships are, then we actually embed so much more intelligence into those information structures that the information actually becomes knowledge. And in this case here, once you have your enterprise information stored as enterprise knowledge, then in fact you don't need code in longer to try to interpret things, because really all you have to do is query things to get to the wisdom and answer questions. So enterprise, the concept of ontology is taking information and just adding so much more value to it by moving it up this knowledge continuum and turning it into something that's self-explanatory in terms of its structure. And when you put data into that, when you put instances into that ontology, you can deeply understand your business just by pulling the threads of the ontology. That's what a knowledge graph is valuable for. And I think if we don't get our heads around that soon, well, it's the people that get their heads around that are going to certainly be at a significant advantage in being able to help their businesses get better understanding of their organizational information. So how do you do that then, and what does it actually look like? So I thought I would just do a little example, and I know we're probably running out of time. After this, I'll stop the questions. The idea is here to try to show you what a little part about enterprise ontology, and as a group, and this is oriented around the concept of the operating model. But we could take this thing and we could slice it and reorient it from any of the different angles. Okay, so how does this story go? We like to think of the business, any business, down two core dimensions. One side is obviously your business as usual, the ongoing execution of business. And the other is change, how you plan to change the business. In fact, it's quite a nice way of thinking things, because when you come to your annual budget, your operating plan, you often find that's exactly how budgets get allocated, towards BAU or towards change. Sometimes it's typically something like 80-20. So what is BAU? We have this concept of BAU is quite prevalent. Everybody talks about it, but what is it? What's the mental image we have of our business as usual? What's the organizing structure we can give people to think of when they think about the BAU? This is where the idea that I was describing about value streams comes in, because the BAU is actually about the ongoing delivery of value in a value stream, driving towards some value proposition specific to some customer segment and experienced by the customer as a customer journey. And if we can think of these as a slice that we just have for every one of our value streams, this is a fantastic organizing structure. So everything you do in your business is just having a whole set of these things, right? Little maps like this. Now, okay, so let's say we talked about earlier, digital transformation is about innovating the value proposition. So what do I innovate here? I can't possibly come up and think about new segments, but what can I change in this thing if I want to innovate my value proposition? Well, what you can change is the other side of the value proposition. Remember saying every value proposition is about an offering for a customer. So the thing that you can change in your value proposition is what you're offering. Well, what is an offering? Well, think of an offering often as a product. And in fact, Agile's taken us down this way, and we've got people now completely orienting their business around product-oriented company. But it's interesting, that whole concept, but I think that people haven't even really thought through that, the whole ontology of that themselves when they do that. There is a lot of goodness in that, but the concept of an offering is so much more than just a product. And if we're just thinking about the product and its features, we're probably missing out on all the other aspects of the offering. And marketing tells us that, there is the price, the place, the promotion. Your digital value proposition may not be about changing too much of a product feature at all, but it might just be about the digital places through which you have to communicate that, or the digital opportunities for promoting the product, or the digital pricing that you can give by going global, or whatever it might be. So yes, every value proposition, in fact, is probably as some sort of change to all of these things. And so we have these concepts of a value proposition canvas, where you can sit in a workshop, you can take a segment, you can take your offering, you can work through what the changes are, and you can come up with a new value prop for every segment, and you can then, from those changes you need to make the offering, drive ideas into the backlog, and you can drive all of your change from a value proposition canvas. Okay, and product sells all of that for you. Okay, what about changing? Yes.
Just conscious we've got 4 minutes left, so just making sure we can fit this last slide in.
Okay, I'll have to accelerate then. So changing the digital business, digitizing the business is about changing the value streams, and we do that typically through change initiatives. So change initiatives have two-part transformation. What's the scope? How are we going to deliver it? How do we define what the scope is? Well, we need to have a sense of what's value. Value is broken as somehow defined in your strategic planning, your goals, your strategies, your objectives, results, decomposed further into the value drivers and business outcomes you're looking at. And so mapping all of it, making sure, prioritizing what you're going to do based on this. Now, what are you actually going to change? Okay, when you're going to change something, how do you actually affect the change on the value stream? Well, you do that through the capability, right? The scope is an uplift to the capability. The value stream is orchestration of capabilities. And what is a capability? This abstract thing made up of the people, the process, the information, and the technology, which collectively explains the operating model. I'm not going to get time to do much more than that, but that then represents for some of the ontology that we bring together in a product. Behind each of these green boxes, there is a whole world of content and knowledge that's connected and aligned. And inside of Jalapeno, you can navigate through that stuff and get through it. Okay, Daryl, why don't I pause and stop there? I'll leave this slide up, which is just a gift to the audience. They can go and get a little ebook that talks about some of the stuff I've described today at that website. And while they're doing that, I'm happy to see if we can fit in a question or two.
Great, thanks, Terry. No, that was fantastic, and I can see the amount of work that's gone in to come up with that meta model for mapping out an organisation. Look, there are some questions. I'll probably just ask one quick one, which I thought was interesting, which was with the availability of all of that information in order to make decisions, does that increase decision complexity?
Well, yeah, that's a very interesting one. I mean, one of the common things that feedback I get at the end of trying to get all this across is, oh my gosh, that is huge and overwhelming. And where do I start and how do I? Well, actually, so it's not what we have to do when we do as architects, we bring content together and we create these insights. It doesn't actually exist. It's not worth anything unless we can get it to the right people and get our stakeholders have understanding what that stuff is. So, and that I think is perhaps as architects, we need to have a good hard look at ourselves, this ivory tower we live in. We've probably, our biggest failure has been in helping and allowing the rest of the organization see the value in what we do. Now, so it's a very important question. You need to be able to publish content out to those people, and it has to be succinct, it has to be the right content. So we're very focused on creating what we call enterprise executive consoles, which are small little windows of contextual knowledge, role-based, that just gives them that content that they need to see in their views and that have been imprinted in their brains, but in a dynamic way. And so, yes, if you were to let them loose on the workbench too much, it has to be through in a filtered way.
Great. Yeah, no, that's a great way of looking at it. Just a comment in from Chris Kempster saying, excellent presentation. Maybe a future presentation on demonstrated examples. Great work. So obviously people are appreciative of what you've shown us today and impressed about the way that you've put the solution together. So, and thanks for the link to the ebook. And with that, I do have to do some special sort of handover now at the end of this session. So I'm just going to say thank you very much.